Hello again, Salem. Once again, it's William Legault from Salem Digest in the studios at Salem Access Television here on Derby Street. And we're bringing to you another candidate, this time an at-large candidate, Frederick Norton.
That's me.
Frederick or Fred? What should I call you?
Fred is fine.
Should have covered that first. What was I thinking?
Fred is totally good. It's flexible and no one misspells it because it's the weird French version.
I could spell it with a PH instead
You can
of an
do
F.
it. I mean, like, I'm flexible.
Absolutely,
Whatever.
absolutely.
As long as I know people are addressing me, I'm pretty much okay with it.
Well, thanks for being here. You
My
got anything
pleasure,
you want
yeah.
to say before we get started?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm really curious to know what people want to know. Like, as a person who reads and does a lot of like philosophy, I can't think of a more boring way to go about things than talking about myself. Like, it's not a thing that I'm 100% great with necessarily, but people need to know what I feel and how I think about these things. And
Well, keep in mind as we go along, if you're boring yourself, you're boring me.
fair enough.
We don't want that.
Okay.
Let's jump right into the questions.
Sure.
All the at-large candidates get the same questions. All the candidates get basically this same first question. This is your first run for public office in Salem?
Not just Salem, but anywhere. Yeah.
Anywhere?
I've never run for public office before at any time.
So the question is, Fred,
Yep.
why are you doing this to yourself? What's your motivation here?
That's a good question, actually. It's one that I ask myself since I pulled papers. The short version of it is because there are things about how I see the working class being treated in Salem. So I grew up in Dorchester, South Boston, where that wave of gentrification that went through that area rendered it largely uninhabitable by the working class. My grandfather owned the house that I grew up in. He paid something like 70 grand for it when he bought it in the 70s. It sold for 580 grand 10 years ago. And now it's a set of condos that even with a full-time job and you couldn't afford. You couldn't afford to live in. And I see the same patterns that I saw growing up that led to that situation happening here in Salem. And it's not that I think that anybody in particular is working against it, but I don't think that anyone on the city council rents. I don't think any of them have any sense of urgency on it because it won't ever impact them if nothing happens. It'll only impact other people. And that's not a personal attack on any of them. It's just you don't consider what you don't consider.
Well, Salem historically is a blue-collar town.
It
We
is.
started off otherwise back 200-something years ago.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But we turned into an immigrant city and a blue-collar city. And you're right, it become difficult to be able to afford to live here. What are the solutions, Fred? I mean, what can you do?
Well, so for a start, and this is going to play into some of the other questions that you've put to other candidates.
My
and
clever
myself.
questions?
Yeah. One of the things that we can do in terms of that is we kind of have to stop using the HUD formula. So the Housing and Urban Development formula for the greater Boston area, which is what we're a part of. So here's how it works, and I apologize now, there is math. I'm sorry, but it's going to have to be the case. So the way that it works is you take the area median income, and then you get 70% of that, and that's the low income threshold, right? 30% of your income is what's affordable rent. So in Salem, for example, the median household income is about $69,000 a year. It's like $68,800 and change. But at $69,000 is about the average median income for a household, which means that affordability hovers around $48,000. That's the low income threshold if we're using Salem numbers, which puts the rent at somewhere around $1,300 a month to make it affordable. Now that's the household income. Like the per capita income's like $35,000. All right, again, I apologize for math. The problem is that we're part of the Greater Boston Group, which sets our median income at 120 grand. And then it's 70 grand is where low income starts. So I think, and this is not like me saying this is not me being particularly clever. This came out with the housing report a couple of years ago. 83 to 84% of Salem residents are considered low income because we live in that Boston area for HUD. And that stretches from Gloucester to Weymouth, and I think as far west as Natick. And so trying to use those numbers when we go, yeah, see, like, this is an affordable housing unit. If you make 70 grand a year, you're low income, that counts. It doesn't work. The math won't hold up. The formula's fine, but it's what's called giggle law, right? Garbage in, garbage out. If you start at the wrong position, you're going to end at the position you weren't aiming for. And that's where that's the hard numbers that we're looking at.
You're the first person to actually break it down like that. We've had AMI conversations with multiple candidates. So, of course, that's set basically at the federal level.
Yeah.
How do we solve that?
So part of it is going to have to go to not just the city level, but the state level. The state level, like Massachusetts outlawed rent control, which hampers a lot of municipalities in terms of this. And I know everyone who's a landlord, including my own, probably feels leery when those words get tossed around, rent control. But the fact of the matter is that it actually helps smaller landlords because they're not getting taxed on the market value of a Boston apartment, which is where that goes when you can't do this. That's what interferes with them. And it hurts everyone because you have people that, there's this sort of weird idea that either everyone will one day be a big shot or kind of is. And that's the selling point that made people in the I want to say 94 is when I think Massachusetts outlawed rent control. That's where that goes. And that's what happens. It was only rent control in like 3 cities in all of Massachusetts. And in those cities, overwhelming support for rent control. It was only outside of those places where they hadn't had to deal with it. And now that that's happening, I think the majority of people who support rent control, even smaller landlords, it's only like big development places that are really going to be hurt by actual rent control. If you have less than 100 units, it's not going to hurt your bottom line. It's probably going to help you.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So we're going to move on now a little bit to zoning.
Sure.
But the reality is it kind of ties
Yeah,
into
well,
the
I mean,
same-
it's all
the
linked
same
together, yeah.
conversation, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a big issue in Salem, has been for a long time, will be moving forward.
Yeah, of course.
Do you consider our current zoning code adequate, or is it time to have a deep look at it for a serious revision?
I don't know that any zoning code is ever going to be like complete in any sense. At the risk of sounding like a nerd, and I'm sorry, it's not math, but it's going to be history. Jefferson pointed this out. He goes, I don't think that it's reasonable to have the following generation beholden to the previous one in terms of their rules. I'm paraphrasing. I completely butchered that quote.
I don't think Jefferson's going to mind.
I don't think he'll put up a big stink about it either. But I know that there are probably history nerds that will watch this and complain. So I know I got it wrong. But in terms of I feel like the ADU, for example, the accessory dwelling unit that got passed recently, I thought that was great. I thought that was a wonderful piece of changing the zoning ordinance. That was a wonderful idea. I mean, a lot of people were already doing it illegally. We might as well make it legal and slap some rules on it. But I don't think there's ever going to be that moment. Like, there's always going to be something that's going to need like a particular exception. And in terms of the zoning in Salem very specifically, like one of the things that's come up is, particularly in South Salem, which is where I live, is the idea of putting residential stuff into Shetland Park. And the idea of doing that there. And I'm not sure how much support there is for it and that's a lot of rezoning to try to do that. But the fact is that Shetland Park isn't operating anywhere near full capacity. So how do we then solve these problems? How do we then thread that needle? And I don't believe that there's going to be a solid solution that's going to work everywhere. Like, I don't want to rezone the McIntyre Historic District. I like walking through there. I really enjoy it. But at the same time, too, we got to kind of be a little bit practical and be like, okay, we're going to set these aside. We're going to have to look at them later, though. Like nothing, I don't think there's anything that can be held like sacrosanct that we can't look at and be like, okay, we're going to have to talk about this at some point. That giant vacant lot right next to the Community Life Center, for example, that was supposed to have affordable housing put in. And hasn't materialized either. And that's, again, not any one person's fault. But that's a site that we could put affordable housing on without a problem. I think, as I recall, all of the environmental stuff on it came out fine. Yeah.
It's all been done.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's a question of the development, and I know that that's a sticking point for a lot of like the neighbors and abutters of that property. I'd like a chance to put it to them that, you know, low income isn't what we're talking. We're not talking about, you know, we're talking about working class people. We're talking about people that make 35, 50 grand a year. That's what we're discussing. We're talking about people working full time, some of them 2 jobs. And not having that housing available is going to hurt our economics in the long run because, you know, let's be honest, if someone has a choice between working here in Salem and making 35 grand a year or working in some place where it's cheaper to live and making 35 grand a year, where would you reasonably expect them to go? Where they can stretch their dollars further. Look at how hard it has been. And you don't take my word for this. Again, nobody ever take my word for anything. Feel free to check anything I say. You look at like the hotels, the restaurants, they're having trouble hiring. And it's not unique to Salem, but it's endemic to a lot of the area. But if you look at them having trouble hiring, it's because the cost of living where they're trying to hire is way out of proportion to what they're paying. So either we have to raise the minimum wage drastically, or we have to start looking at creating affordable housing that's actually affordable. It can't be the Boston level of affordable. It can't be 70 grand a year in terms of an income. It has to be localized. Like there are no other workable alternatives that I can see, and I don't know that anyone's put anything forward.
Well, you brought up Shetland as part of this zoning conversation.
I did.
And we're going to stick with Shetland.
I like that.
All right, Fred, what do you want to see there?
Man, wouldn't it be nice to have manufacturing again in Salem to some degree?
To some degree.
It's never going to come back to what it was. It'll never be what it was in the heyday of like Parker Brothers and, you know, Sylvania and stuff like that. For lack of a better term, that ship has sailed.
I have to throw in a word for the old men at Plastics.
Yeah.
Which I worked for in their last incarnation before they sold for pieces back in the early 2000s.
Yeah. I mean, what would I like to see in Shetland Park? That's a really good question. I'd like to see, if we could, I'd like to see more adult education. There's a program at the Council on Aging that they run. It's paid for, I think, through Catholic Charities, where they run English as a second language class once a week for seniors who don't have English as their primary language. You have an entire community in the Point that aren't able to access the jobs that they should be able to have. Not because they don't have the talent, not because they don't have the will to do it, but because they simply lack the language, right? And it's not anything that is lacking in them. It's lacking in us. Like people don't need to assimilate. They need to integrate. They need to be able to bring their strengths and qualities into the situation. And by having that option available, you're allowing more and more people to contribute and to in turn receive what they can, you know, like it's a feedback loop that boosts everybody. And that's something that I would love to see in there is like maybe an adult education. Not that you couldn't do it at the community life center, but trying to set up classrooms and have it be regular down there, I think would be problematic. There's already education space set up down there, and it could be modified in a few different places. And there are some good companies down there already. I wouldn't mind seeing expand, and hopefully they can.
Would you rather see it stay more of a industrial and commercial space as opposed to residential?
If we can't solve the residential thing elsewhere, I mean, I'm willing to consider it for residential. I mean, I would be. But it would have to be, again, it would have to be under the same conventions as before. It would have to be, we have to use the Salem equations. We have to use that math. It can't be just another, you know.
Well, you're talking about this new math that doesn't exist.
No,
from the AMI. You were talking math earlier.
Yeah.
We're talking that Boston AMI.
Yeah.
The math that you're talking really doesn't exist right now. There is
sure
no
it is. We can do that. We could easily just go, okay, we'll use Essex County.
But you'd have to create that.
Sure.
Doesn't exist yet.
But it can be done. That's the nice thing about government and about, you know, this kind of thing. These rules don't exist out there in space. As long as we're not violating the city charter, the state constitution, or the U.S. Constitution, we can set it up how we want it to set up. You know, that's the thing that people have to remember about government. It's philosophy that's being applied. It's like physics and engineering. Government is applied philosophy. That's what it is. And what we want it to be is what we can make it.
All right, so let's move on across the harbor,
Sure.
out there at Ford Ave.
Yeah.
Another big zoning issue.
Oh, yeah.
What are we going to do out there? What kind of zoning do we want to see there? What kind of mix of uses, if any, do we want to see there? You have any ideas on what you want to see out there?
So if you're talking about like Lee Ford Terrace, I assume
I'm talking
specifically, or
about
just
footprint.
Footprint.
We haven't gotten to Lee Ford Terrace
Oh, okay.
yet. You're anticipating me.
Well, you know. Again, I spent 5 years working for the Council on Aging in Salem. I'm currently on the board, a part of the board for the Friends of the Council on Aging. So Lee Ford Terrace has been something that I've been like keeping a really close eye on, et cetera, for that. So that's where my mind immediately goes. Honestly, it doesn't go to footprint. I know that it's being discussed to put housing in there and to put a few other things in there. I'm not sure what will work in there, honestly and truly. Like, are we expecting that a lot of people are going to want to live right next to a power plant? Now, I'm not arguing that it's not okay. As far as I know, like, again, all the ecological studies seem to be fine.
Right, and they're talking about more maritime use, which there's some restrictions that you have to have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know they're talking about, I know there's been discussion about putting some wind turbines out offshore, which is a lovely idea, actually. I think that's great. But in terms of footprint itself, I mean, I don't see why we couldn't have some lovely maritime commercial activity down there. I'm as someone who does a fair amount of fishing, I'm very surprised there aren't any like fishing boats that go out of Salem. Like, I know Mahi does some tours and stuff like that, but like, are there any like? I don't think there are any like commercial fishing.
Very few.
Yeah.
Very few. There used to be quite a bit more.
Yeah.
Central Wharf used to have commercial fishing, just about everywhere. There used to be a lot more, but it's hard. It's a longer ride.
Sure.
Out to the harbor.
Yeah.
From Salem to get anywhere. It's why the whale watch doesn't come out here anymore. They have a shorter ride from Gloucester to go out and watch those guys.
But even charter fishing, I would imagine, could be done. I imagine we get some stripers that come in through here, and I'm surprised that we don't have anyone doing them.
Well, it is really, as you said, there's no place to put those boats.
Right.
It makes it difficult.
So why, we can use the power plant Winthrop does it with Deer Island. You can like, there are charter fishing that will come out of different docks throughout Boston. They will go right around Deer Island, and they catch some really nice fish out of there. I've done it a couple of times. It's pretty good.
Nice.
But it's, these are all things that can be done, and, you can get small businesses in there. You can get those kinds of partnerships in there because, again, with a service economy like we have, that's what pushes things up. It's getting those small businesses to that point.
Well, let's move on to the question 3. It's development. Again, it all ties
it all ties together. It's great.
All ties together.
Yeah.
And it'll let you segue into your Lee Ford Terrace thing.
Yeah.
It's a development of buzzword. There's a lot of buzzwords these days.
Yeah, there are.
It provokes discussion. It provokes argument. One of the arguments is that Salem's ancient, and I put that in quotations on purpose, infrastructure is collapsing because we are overdeveloping. Another buzzword.
Yeah.
Is that true, or is our infrastructure actually keeping pace with the development?
I don't think we're keeping pace. If I'm being honest, as someone who drove a van around this city, no, it's not. But this is one of those things, again, and forgive me because this is my inner philosopher. It's going to depend on what do you mean by development and overdevelopment, right? Like, if you just mean, I don't like the fact that there are apartment buildings going into Salem that are higher than 3 stories. That's a big difference between that and saying, like, I don't think the infrastructure, like our basic like sewage, power, water lines are going to handle what we're putting in. I think Salem has the same problem that most of the United States has, in that people kick the can down the road. It's hard to get people to spend preventatively, right? Like, that's a hard pitch in a good day to make. And like going, guys, if we do this, we'll save money for like over the next 10, 15 years. That's hard to get people to put that money up front. And so I'm not blaming anyone that couldn't make that pitch. That's a hard sell to make. But that's where our problems of infrastructure really come from. It's not so much that, the development is causing the infrastructural problems. It's that we never set ourselves up to succeed anyway. It's not like, like how many major roads in and out of Salem are there? 4? tops, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, you've got 114 at either end. You've got 107. You've got 1A. Like, it isn't going to, oh, and you got the Beverly Bridge. Sorry, Beverly. But, you know, you've got just a few roads, and we only have 8 square miles to work with, and that's our total land mass. That's not including, like, the Salem Woods, where we're not putting any development.
Right.
So what has to happen is it has to be done not just with an idea that, okay, in like 5 years this will be good. We have to be looking 10, 15, 20 years down the line. A big thing that came up a few years ago when they were looking at affordable housing was that deed restrictions on a lot of the development that happened in, I want to say, the late 60s, early 70s, right? It's like when, what was the Bell Atlantic building, right, on Norman Street.
Right.
When that got converted to condos, et cetera. And a lot of those that first sort of wave of conversion happened. They had, the city council at the time slapped a 50-year deed restriction that said they had to keep 10% or 1 unit, whichever is higher, as affordable. Well, 50 years is up. Now, you know, that happens, and we, you know, now it's in perpetuity. Now we've learned, like, yeah, 50 years runs out a lot faster than you think.
It surely does.
So when you talk about development, that's kind of what we're looking at. Like, if we're not looking at how do we keep working class families and jobs in Salem, we're going to lose the basic service economy that we run on. It's not possible to maintain that without housing that's affordable. And so, you know, I've talked about this before. I don't think it should be 10%. I think it should be at least 50.
Wow.
I'm in favor of bigger numbers on this one. Ideally, I'd say 100. But I don't know that anyone will go for 100.
That might be a lawsuit.
That might be, but I would say, like, at least any new development has to be 50% affordable, and it has to be using the math that I laid out earlier. Like, otherwise, we're setting ourselves up to fail 10, 15, 20 years down the line when we can't get service jobs in here.
Right.
Like, if we want those jobs to stay in place, if we want those companies to keep going, and we all do, I assume.
I think so.
That's what's got to happen.
So we're going to move on
Sure.
to Leaford Terrace.
All right.
You brought that up initially.
I did.
And it should be a part of this conversation.
It
and
absolutely
it is a part
should.
of this conversation. How do you see the city repairing, renovating, or rebuilding Leaford Terrace? What should it look like? And what should the density be? And, I'm sorry,
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
it seems to be, from any state officials that I've talked to, or higher city officials, the days of the state building these things by themselves are over, and private-public development is the reality of the situation. How do you see that working out at Leaford Terrace?
Well, I guess I'm unrealistic. That's fair. I'm not a fan of the idea of the private-public development idea of it, because and it's not a slight. I know that I'm generally familiar with the company that they're talking about, and this is not a slight to them. I'm simply opposed to it as sort of a philosophical principle, because any company is going to have to try to make money. I recognize that they're a not-for-profit, but they've also got to, pay the bills and keep the roof over
Not
their
for profit doesn't mean they don't make money.
Exactly, right? And in the case of Leaford Terrace, I don't know if you've ever been in any of those
Oh,
apartments.
sure.
Okay, good. So, all right, so you'll know what I'm talking about. The design on all of those, like, it predates the ADA, and we've got seniors living there. Any kind of renovation, anything that we do on that property, we're going to have to tear the whole thing down.
Right.
Okay.
And that's inclusive of Pioneer Terrace,
Yep.
Rainbow Terrace,
Rainbow Terrace, you might be able to get
Yeah.
away with some of it.
and you have the couple up off of Boston Street. You got one up off of North Street.
Yep.
Off
Yeah.
of Broad Street. There's
I
a
think,
few others.
is it Elliott Terrace? Or was
Yeah.
it Elliott Terrace? Is that the
Yeah,
one?
I think so, yeah.
It sounds right. But yeah, no, I mean, I'm familiar with them. Again, like when I used to drive the vans for the Council on Aging, I've been to all of them. Even the one there that's just south of Pioneer Terrace, that really small one there, that little development, the square
Right,
one.
yeah.
The one that no one ever remembers is actually
But
there.
it's there.
Yeah, because it kind of does blend into the neighborhood.
Off of, that's
Summit F. It's on
off
Summit.
of
Yeah,
Summit,
yeah, yeah.
Yep.
I'm sorry. Gene Stella, I apologize for not remembering where you live.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
There are little pockets all around the city.
Yeah. But that's all of those we have to kind of look at. And like, I think Lee Fort Terrace, it's got to be at least 2 stories when we go to redevelop it. Like, it has to be. Like,
Well, you have to be able to put more units in.
yeah, I mean, like, but going up is like, and I recognize, listen, I'm not saying that the neighbors are going to have to just take it. Like, no, like 2 stories, I think, is a good compromise. That's not really destroying anybody's view. And it can be done in a way that's efficient and useful, and it doubles the amount of public available housing. I don't think, and here's the thing, when people talk about the days of the state building this kind of public housing, well, when did it end? In Salem, for example, right? What was it, 1990? Was that the last time we added any public housing?
The last time the state added any public housing?
Salem. Any public housing in Salem? I would say 1990, right? Maybe 91.
Probably around there, but the state hasn't built anything since Charter Street, across the street here.
Yeah.
And that was in the 70s.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I feel pretty well rested. I feel like we've taken a good long break from it. We're all pretty well rested. We can start doing it again. I recognize, again, it's a hard thing to get people to sell, because what you inevitably have is that same pushback you get when you try and talk about increasing public transportation. Everyone kind of looks at it as people getting away with a freebie or something like that, when in point of fact, it helps all of us, right? It does us no good. Like, if you don't want to live in a city where there's a large homelessness problem, yeah, maybe get some housing. Maybe start working on that as a plan. That's, rather than sit there and call the police to like roust them, maybe we should look at a long-term solution. And that's the problem to me. That's where I see it going. We're working on it backwards. So like in the case of Lee Fort Terrace, ideally I would like to see it remain entirely public housing, add a second story, and design it so that it's more efficient in terms of space. I was talking with a group of people, and one of them mentioned I think it was the Venetian design, that what the idea is that you build public housing and that everyone lives in it no matter what their income. And it's just public housing available for residents, and what you don't bother testing for income, you simply vary the rent according to what they're dealing with. But then everyone has a stake in the housing. Everyone has a stake in public housing that way. That's pretty radical. I don't think I'd suggest that for Salem. I don't think we're there. But I feel like adding to public housing, adding to affordable housing is the only way that we're going to deal with this. It's the only way to sort of stem that tide.
All right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to get into a question now that I've asked every council candidate.
Ooh.
Well, decorum and the demeanor of the city council.
Yeah.
The way that they speak to each other during meetings, whether
Sure.
it be actual meetings at City Hall or on Zoom, they just don't seem to get along a lot. Is that a problem that you think needs fixing, or is that just what you would expect from a deliberative body?
I mean, as someone who's a fan of the musical Hamilton, we smack each other in the press and we don't print retractions. And that's been an ongoing problem since the beginning. That's just a problem with democracies generally. I don't expect suddenly we're going to solve it in Salem. I feel like we should strive to be polite. And we should strive to maintain that decorum, with the understanding that that's not always going to happen. I think generally people do a decent job. I think that, obviously, there's been a few of those where it's been like, really, guys? Can't we just, no one has to like each other, but we've all got to show up to work and deal with each other. And that's, I don't know, that's the difference. That's how I would see it. As I don't think that you're going to get civility, especially when people talk past each other, right? It's why, when we talked about development and overdevelopment and underdevelopment, and I'm not trying to split hairs when I'm going, it depends on your definition. I say it that way because I want people to understand what I mean when I use those words, because we don't all mean the same thing.
That's correct.
And so when you have people just talking right past each other, who's listening? It's an inevitable consequence of people not trying to explain first what they mean and then talking about what they're trying to do.
And now, of course, you have communications between the council and the mayor's office.
Yeah.
But there's the reverse, the communication from the mayor's office to the council,
Sure.
from the various city departments.
Yeah.
Do you think that we're doing a good job there, or could there be improvement?
I mean, always improvement. In that sense, I mean, listen, I've had to sit on some of those meetings. I've had to write for like I've had to do it from the other end. I've had to help write budgets for a city department that then get submitted to the council. So from that end, I'm relatively familiar with how the information goes. I think that actually works pretty well. At least the ones I've seen. That's usually a pretty easy, relatively transparent process. From the city council's point of view, and this is kind of this is a personal thought of mine, and I don't know how many city councilors are familiar with the day-to-day operations of these departments, such that they could really sit there and dissect a budget request or how that communication works. They're not supposed to be, right? That's not
their job.
Yeah, right, exactly, right? And so, but it does at the same time cause that problem of communication, right? So it has to be filtered through the mayor's office and then sent out to the city council. Why? Because the mayor's office deals with this on a day-to-day basis. It's not that, it's not an attempt to occlude the situation. It's a necessity, right? So in terms of that communication, I mean, is there room for improvement? Sure, always. In terms of generally how people deal with it, I think people do a pretty decent job.
All right. So we're almost done, believe it or not.
Really?
It's a quick 35 minutes.
That goes fast.
Real quick now.
Yeah.
Let's assume you get elected.
Sure.
Best of luck.
Yep.
What's your top 2 priorities right away?
Well, I'd like to think that I made it clear with housing as one of them.
Well, I'm just giving you another chance to make it
that's
clearer.
fine.
Yeah.
Obviously, low income and affordable housing. And here's the thing: if I don't get elected and someone else takes this up and starts running with these ideas, I will be happier than anyone. By all means, if someone takes this and runs with it, steal my ideas. Happy to have handed it off. And I feel the same way. And I also want to work on making sure that people are included in the conversation, that we aren't missing out on voices that don't have time to sit there and get involved as much. Listen, I work 50 to 56 hours a week at my daytime job. When I'm not doing that, I've written a children's book. It is hard for people that are working 50 hours, 60 hours a week to get involved in politics. I can't tell you how difficult it has been throughout all of this. But that kind of thing diminishes, at that point, you're just getting the people with the most amount of time and the loudest voices, which isn't necessarily symbolic of what people actually want. And to a degree, though, that's reinforced by, if you look at the primaries, because this is being filmed after the primaries.
It most certainly is.
And if you look at the turnout for the primaries, while it's better than it has been in the past, we were at what, less than 25% full?
21.9.
Yeah.
I don't think they've finalized it yet, but right around there.
All right, so let's call it 23, 23% of possible voters showed up for the primary, in which you have the mayor coming up for election, in which you have 4 wards having primaries, and only 1 in 4 people showed up to say, hey, I want my voice to be heard on this point. And again, that's not endemic to Salem. That is a countrywide thing. 21.5%, even 21.5% would be great under other circumstances. But it says something that those voices don't get heard. And I don't think it's anyone deliberately acting against them. I think it's just the circumstances that we're all dealing with.
All right.
And that's where they get left behind. Either they don't feel that there is someone they can directly talk to, or they simply don't have time to chase down who they need to talk to. And then they feel like they don't have any skin in the game of who gets elected, because it's going to be the same thing anyway.
All righty. Well, thanks a lot, Fred. We appreciate
My pleasure.
it.
Yeah.
This is William Legault from Salem Digest, here with Fred Norton, Councilor at Large candidate. The general election is on the 2nd of November, and I'm going to kind of steal a phrase partially here from Fred to say that the only votes that get left behind are the votes that aren't made. So get out there and vote, guys.
Excellent. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. We'll see you at another candidate before you know it. Thank you.